I'm Maya Chen, 28. And the moment my brother pointed his finger at me across our family's bakery counter and declared that I was the reason Sweet Dreams Bakery was failing, I knew my life was about to change forever. What he didn't know was that exactly 1 year later, I'd be sitting in his old office chair when he walked in desperately needing a job, about to discover that the sister he'd thrown away had just become his boss. The look of shock and humiliation on his face when he realized I was the mysterious new owner who'd bought out the family business would make every sleepless night and penny saved worth it. But the journey to get there nearly broke me in ways I never expected. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Growing up in the Chen family meant that flour was always under my fingernails, and the scent of vanilla extract was permanently embedded in my clothes. Sweet Dreams Bakery wasn't just our family business, it was our identity, our legacy, and the foundation of every conversation around our dinner table for as long as I could remember. My parents, David and Linda Chen, had opened the bakery in 1995 when I was just 3 years old, pouring their life savings and immigrant dreams into a small storefront in downtown Millbrook, a quaint suburb where everyone knew everyone and word of mouth could make or break a business overnight. My older brother Jake, who was 5 years my senior, had always been positioned as the heir apparent to the bakery empire. Though calling it an empire was generous, considering we operated out of a single location with 6 employees and revenues that fluctuated with the seasons and local economic conditions. Jake possessed that natural charisma that made customers light up when he walked into the front of the house, remembering their names, their usual orders, and asking about their families with genuine interest that translated directly into customer loyalty and repeat business. I, on the other hand, had found my calling in the back of the house, where precision and creativity merged in the alchemy of baking. While Jake charmed customers and managed the front-end operations, I spent countless hours perfecting recipes, developing new products, and ensuring that every croissant that left our ovens was perfectly laminated, every cake was flawlessly decorated, and every loaf of bread met the exacting standards that had built our reputation in the community over more than 2 decades. The division of labor had worked beautifully for years, creating a symbiotic relationship where Jake's people skills complemented my technical expertise, and together we had helped our parents build Sweet Dreams into a beloved local institution. Our signature items, including my grandmother's secret recipe chocolate chip cookies and the custom wedding cakes that had become legendary in our town, were the result of this collaborative approach that leveraged both of our strengths. Everything began to unravel in the spring of 2019, when a combination of factors created what business analysts might call a perfect storm of challenges for small, independent bakeries. The opening of a large commercial grocery store chain on the outskirts of town brought with it an in-store bakery that could undersell our products by 30 to 40%. Thanks to their massive purchasing power and willingness to operate their bakery department at a loss to drive overall store traffic. Simultaneously, the rise of dietary trends focusing on gluten-free, keto, and other specialized eating plans began to erode our traditional customer base. As people who had been regulars for years started seeking alternatives that we weren't equipped to provide without significant investment in new ingredients, training, and separate preparation areas to avoid cross-contamination. The final blow came when the city announced a major construction project that would disrupt traffic patterns and limit parking in our area for 18 months, making it difficult for customers to reach us during what should have been our busiest periods. Our monthly revenues, which had been steadily growing for years, began to decline precipitously, dropping from an average of $45,000 per month to barely $30,000 by the end of summer. The reduction in income meant that we had to make difficult decisions about inventory, staffing, and even basic maintenance, creating a downward spiral where declining quality and service led to further customer losses. I responded to these challenges by throwing myself into innovation and cost-cutting measures, working 16-hour days to develop new product lines that could appeal to changing consumer preferences while maintaining our commitment to quality. I researched suppliers who could provide organic, gluten-free, and specialty ingredients at reasonable prices, experimented with recipes that could accommodate various dietary restrictions, and even taught myself social media marketing to help promote our business online. My efforts included launching a line of custom dessert boxes for corporate events, partnering with local coffee shops to supply them with pastries, and developing a catering menu that could generate higher margin revenue streams. I also implemented inventory management systems that reduced waste, negotiated better terms with our suppliers, and cross-trained our staff to increase efficiency during peak periods. Jake, meanwhile, seemed to interpret the crisis as validation of his belief that the business needed more aggressive marketing and expansion, rather than the careful, methodical approach I favored. He pushed for expensive advertising campaigns that ate into our already strained budget, advocated for opening a second location despite our current struggles, and became increasingly frustrated with what he perceived as my conservative, risk-averse approach to business management. The tension between our different philosophies came to a head during a particularly difficult family meeting in October. When our accountant presented financial statements showing that we were barely breaking even and would need to make significant changes to remain viable through the winter months, Jake had arrived at the meeting with a presentation outlining his vision for dramatic expansion, including plans for franchising the Sweet Dreams concept and opening locations in 3 neighboring towns within the next 2 years. My parents, who had always deferred to Jake's judgment on business matters due to his natural leadership abilities and his business degree from the state university, seemed intrigued by his ambitious plans despite the obvious contradiction between our current financial struggles and his proposals for aggressive growth. When I raised concerns about the feasibility of expansion given our current challenges, Jake dismissed my objections as fear-based thinking that was holding the business back from its true potential. The conflict escalated when I presented my own analysis, showing that the market conditions requiring us to adapt our current operations were likely to persist for several years, making expansion not just risky, but potentially catastrophic for our family's financial security. I had spent weeks researching industry trends, analyzing competitor strategies, and developing conservative projections that suggested we needed to focus on stabilizing our existing operation before considering any form of growth. Jake's response was swift and brutal, accusing me of being negative, unimaginative, and fundamentally opposed to the kind of bold decision-making that successful businesses required. He argued that my focus on operational efficiency and cost control was small-minded thinking that would condemn Sweet Dreams to mediocrity, and that my resistance to his expansion plans demonstrated a fundamental lack of vision and entrepreneurial spirit. The argument reached its crescendo when Jake stood up from the conference table in our small office, pointed directly at me, and declared in front of our parents and accountant that I was the primary reason the bakery was failing. According to his analysis, my conservative approach had created a culture of limitation and fear that prevented the business from capitalizing on opportunities. And my influence over operational decisions had resulted in stagnation that competitors were exploiting to steal our market share. He went further, suggesting that my technical skills in baking, while competent, were not unique or irreplaceable, and that the business would be better served by bringing in professional management with the vision and courage to implement the kind of aggressive growth strategy that modern businesses required to survive and thrive. The implication was clear. Jake believed that removing me from decision-making authority was necessary for Sweet Dreams to reach its potential. My parents' response to this confrontation revealed the deep-seated family dynamics that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. Despite my years of dedication, my technical expertise, and my obvious love for the business, they seemed more persuaded by Jake's confidence and charisma than by my methodical approach to problem-solving. When pressed to choose between supporting Jake's expansion plans or my stabilization strategy, they ultimately sided with their eldest son, agreeing that perhaps fresh perspective was needed in the business operations. The decision was framed as a temporary restructuring that would allow Jake to implement his vision while giving me time to step back and gain perspective on the challenges facing the business. In reality, it was a coup that removed me from any meaningful role in the operation I had helped build and maintain for most of my adult life. My parents offered me a token consulting role that would involve minimal responsibility and reduced compensation, essentially making me an employee in the business where I had previously been a partner and decision-maker. The humiliation of being publicly blamed for the bakery's struggles, combined with the realization that my own family was willing to scapegoat me rather than acknowledge the complex market forces affecting our Pearl Bay industry, created a level of hurt and anger that I had never experienced before. The betrayal felt particularly acute because I had sacrificed social relationships, dating opportunities, and alternative career paths to dedicate myself completely to Sweet Dreams, believing that my loyalty and hard work would be recognized and valued by my family. Jake wasted no time in implementing his vision for the business, immediately hiring an expensive marketing consultant and beginning the process of securing locations for expansion. He also brought in new management systems and hired additional staff, creating overhead expenses that further strained our already tight cash flow. Within 3 months of my demotion, the financial situation had deteriorated significantly, with monthly losses mounting and our cash reserves being depleted to fund operations and expansion activities. Rather than acknowledge that his strategy might be flawed, Jake doubled down on his approach, arguing that the short-term pain was necessary to position Sweet Dreams for long-term success. He secured a significant loan against the business and our family's personal assets to fund continued expansion, betting everything on his belief that aggressive growth would eventually generate the revenues needed to justify the increased expenses. I watched this unfold from my marginalized position with a mixture of vindication and horror, recognizing that the very problems I had predicted were manifesting exactly as I had warned they would. However, my attempts to raise concerns were dismissed as sour grapes from someone who had been proven wrong about the direction the business needed to take. My parents, committed to supporting Jake's leadership, seemed to interpret my warnings as attempts to undermine his authority rather than genuine concerns about the company's financial stability. The breaking point came in March of 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic created unprecedented challenges for restaurants and food service businesses across the country. The government-mandated lockdowns and social distancing requirements immediately eliminated our foot traffic, corporate catering business, and special event orders, leaving us with only minimal online and delivery sales to generate revenue. The timing couldn't have been worse, as Jake's expansion plans had left us with multiple lease obligations, increased staffing costs, and debt payments that continued regardless of our ability to generate income. Within 2 weeks of the lockdown orders, it became clear that Sweet Dreams was facing an existential crisis that threatened not only the business, but our family's financial security. The loans that Jake had secured were personally guaranteed by our parents, meaning that failure of the business would result in the loss of their home, retirement savings, and everything they had worked to build over decades of sacrifice and hard work. Faced with this catastrophic situation, Jake's response was to panic and look for someone to blame, rather than taking responsibility for the decisions that had created our vulnerability. In a heated family meeting that took place over video conference due to lockdown restrictions, he once again pointed the finger at me, arguing that my previous negativity and resistance to change had created the underlying weaknesses that made the business unable to weather the current crisis. According to Jake's revisionist history, the conservative approach I had advocated would have left Sweet Dreams even more vulnerable to economic disruption. And my lack of support for his expansion plans had created internal conflicts that prevented the business from building the resilience needed to survive unexpected challenges. He conveniently ignored the fact that his expansion strategy had consumed our cash reserves and created fixed obligations that were now threatening to destroy everything our family had built. My parents, facing the prospect of losing their life's work and their financial security, or desperate for solutions, and seemed willing to accept Jake's explanation rather than confronting the reality that his leadership had created the crisis. When I attempted to present alternative strategies for navigating the pandemic challenges, including cost-cutting measures and pivoting to new revenue streams, my suggestions were dismissed as more of the same small thinking that had supposedly created our problems in the first place. The final insult came when Jake announced that he believed the only way to save Sweet Dreams was to bring in outside management with experience in crisis turnaround situations, effectively firing both me and our parents from active roles in the business we had built together. He had already contacted a restaurant management company that specialized in distressed acquisitions, and they had expressed interest in purchasing Sweet Dreams at a significant discount to its pre-pandemic value. This proposal represented the complete abandonment of everything our family had worked to create, essentially giving away decades of effort and investment to avoid personal bankruptcy. What made it even more galling was that Jake presented this surrender as a sophisticated business strategy that demonstrated his ability to make tough decisions, rather than acknowledging it as the inevitable result of his reckless expansion and poor judgment. I realized in that moment that I had a choice to make. I could accept the role of scapegoat and watch everything my family had built be sold off to cover Jake's mistakes. Or I could find a way to fight back and prove that his assessment of both me and the business was fundamentally wrong. The decision was surprisingly easy, despite the pain of family betrayal and the daunting challenge of competing against people who had shaped my entire identity and career. My first step was to quietly begin documenting everything I knew about Sweet Dreams operations, including supplier relationships, customer preferences, recipe formulations, and operational procedures that weren't written down anywhere but existed in the institutional knowledge that I had accumulated over years of hands-on involvement. I also began researching the legal and financial structures that governed our business, learning about ownership percentages, debt obligations, and the processes involved in business acquisitions. What I discovered was that while Jake had been granted operational authority, the actual ownership of Sweet Dreams remained with our parents, who retained a legal right to make decisions about selling or transferring Getrol, the business. This meant that any deal with the management company would require their approval, giving me potential leverage if I could present a viable alternative that would preserve their investment and retirement security. I also learned that the pandemic had created opportunities as well as challenges for food businesses, with many successful operators pivoting to online sales, meal kit delivery, and other innovative approaches that could generate revenue despite social distancing restrictions. The key was having the flexibility and creativity to adapt quickly to changing conditions, rather than being locked into expensive fixed costs and expansion commitments that prevented rapid response to market changes. My plan began to crystallize around the idea of creating a competing acquisition offer that would allow our family to maintain ownership while bringing in the operational changes needed to navigate the current crisis and position Sweet Dreams for future success. This would require me to secure financing, develop a comprehensive business plan, and demonstrate that I possessed the leadership capabilities that Jake and my parents had questioned. The challenge was, but I had been effectively cut out of the business and had limited financial resources to work with, having lived modestly and invested most of my earnings back into Sweet Dreams rather than building personal embers. Wealth. I would need to find investors who believed in both my abilities and the long-term potential of the bakery, while also developing the business expertise that would convince my parents that I represented a better option than selling to outside management. I began by reaching out to former colleagues and industry contacts who might be able to provide advice or connections, carefully avoiding any appearance of undermining Jake's current efforts while gathering information about potential opportunities. I also started taking online courses in business management, financial analysis, and strategic planning, dedicating every spare moment to building the knowledge base that I would need to compete effectively for control of Sweet Dreams. The most crucial breakthrough came when I reconnected with Eleanor Rodriguez, a former customer who had become a successful restaurant investor after selling her own chain of Mexican restaurants. Eleanor remembered me from the many custom cakes I had created for her family celebrations over the years, and she had always been impressed by both the quality of our products and my attention to customer service. Details. When I reached out to Elena to ask for general advice about the restaurant industry during the pandemic, she was immediately interested in learning more about Sweet Dreams' situation. As someone who had built and sold multiple successful food businesses, she understood both the challenges we were facing and the potential opportunities that existed for well-managed operations that could adapt. Changing market conditions. Elena's assessment of our situation was both brutally honest and surprisingly optimistic. She agreed that Jake's expansion strategy had been poorly timed and executed, creating vulnerabilities that the pandemic had exposed in devastating fashion. However, she also believed that Sweet Dreams had fundamental strengths, including brand recognition, product quality, and customer loyalty, that could form the foundation for a successful turnaround if managed properly. More importantly, Elena was willing to consider investing in an acquisition that would keep Sweet Dreams in family hands while providing the capital and expertise needed to implement necessary changes. She proposed a partnership structure where I would retain operational control and ownership majority, while she would provide financing and strategic guidance in exchange for a minority stake and preferred bow. Return on her investment. The partnership offer was exactly what I needed to create a credible alternative to Jake's surrender strategy, but it also required me to step up in ways that I had never been challenged before. Elena made it clear that her investment would be contingent on my ability to demonstrate leadership capabilities and business acumen that went far beyond my technical baking skills, essentially requiring me to prove that I could be the CEO that Sweet Dreams needed during this critical period. I spent the next several months developing a comprehensive business plan that addressed every aspect of Sweet Dreams' operations, from supply chain management and cost control to marketing strategy and revenue. Diversification. I researched successful bakery turnarounds in other markets, analyzed customer data to identify opportunities for growth, and developed financial projections that showed how the business could return to profitability while servicing debt obligations and providing returns for investors. The plan I developed focused on three main strategies: streamlining operations to reduce costs and improve efficiency, developing new revenue streams that could generate income despite pandemic restrictions, and building stronger customer relationships through improved service and community engagement. Each element was supported by detailed implementation timelines, budget requirements, and performance metrics that would allow progress to be measured and adjusted as needed. Meanwhile, Jake's negotiations with the management company were progressing slowly, hampered by the prospective buyer's concerns about the debt load he had accumulated, and their skepticism about the long-term viability of the locations he had chosen for expansion. The lengthy due diligence process was consuming time and resources while generating mounting legal and consulting fees that further strained our cash flow. By late summer, it was becoming clear that Jake's preferred solution was unlikely to materialize on terms that would provide meaningful value to our parents or preserve any of their investment in Sweet Dreams. The management company's most recent offer would essentially wipe out decades of equity building in exchange for assumption of debt obligations, leaving our parents with nothing to show for their life's work except the relief of avoiding personal bankruptcy. This deteriorating situation created the opening I needed to present my alternative proposal, which I did during a family meeting in September where the latest management company offer was being discussed. I had prepared extensively for this presentation, knowing that it represented my only opportunity to convince my parents that I could provide a better solution than either Jake's failed expansion strategy or the fire sale he was now advocating. The presentation began with a detailed analysis of how we had arrived at our current situation, including specific decisions and their financial consequences that demonstrated the problems with Jake's approach. I was careful to focus on business strategy rather than personal attacks, presenting objective data that told the story of expanding expenses and declining margins that had created our vulnerability to breed pandemic-related disruptions. I then outlined my alternative vision for Sweet Dreams, focusing on sustainable growth, operational efficiency, and customer-focused innovation that would position the business for long-term success regardless of DHEN. External economic conditions. The plan included specific revenue targets, cost reduction goals, and timeline for returning to profitability that were based on conservative assumptions and realistic market assessments. The final element of my presentation was the introduction of Elena as a potential investor partner who was prepared to provide the financing needed to implement the turnaround plan while allowing our family to retain Beren. Ownership control. Elena's track record of successful restaurant investments and her willingness to back my leadership provided credibility that my proposal might otherwise have lacked. My parents' reaction was a mixture of surprise, skepticism, and cautious hope that perhaps there was an alternative to losing everything they had worked to build. Jake's response was predictably defensive, attacking both my qualifications and my motives while arguing that my plan was unrealistic and that Elena's involvement represented an unacceptable dilution of Can. Family control over the business. The debate that followed was intense and emotional, with years of family dynamics and business disagreements coming to the surface in ways that were both painful and necessary. Jake accused me of opportunism and trying to capitalize on the crisis he was working to resolve, while I countered that his leadership had created the crisis and that his proposed solution would destroy everything our parents had sacrificed to build. Ultimately, the decision came down to my parents' assessment of which approach offered the best chance of preserving their investment and providing financial security for their retirement. Elena's involvement was crucial to this calculation, as her experience and resources provided credibility to my proposal that I couldn't have achieved on my own. After several weeks of additional meetings, financial analysis, and legal review, my parents agreed to support my acquisition proposal over Jake's management company deal. The decision was devastating to Jake, who had assumed that his position as the designated family business leader was secure regardless of his actual performance results. The formal acquisition process took another 2 months to complete, involving complex negotiations over valuation, financing terms, and the assumption of existing debt obligations. Elena's expertise in structuring business deals was invaluable during this period, as she helped navigate legal requirements and financial arrangements that were far beyond my previous experience. The closing took place in December of 2020, almost exactly 1 year after Jake's expansion strategy had begun to create serious financial problems for Sweet Dreams. I officially became the majority owner and CEO of the business, where I had started as a teenager learning basic baking techniques from my parents. Jake's reaction to losing control of Sweet Dreams was a mixture of anger, humiliation, and disbelief that his younger sister had outmaneuvered him in what he had viewed as his domain of expertise. He initially refused to accept the transition, arguing that the acquisition was illegitimate and that my parents had been manipulated into making a decision that would ultimately harm their interests. When it became clear that the legal transfer was final and irreversible, Jake's attitude shifted to bitter resentment combined with predictions that I would fail even more spectacularly than he had. He refused to participate in any transition activities, and instead began immediately looking for other opportunities, apparently believing that his departure would handicap my ability to operate the business successfully. What Jake didn't understand was that his departure actually made implementation of necessary changes easier, as I no longer had to navigate around his resistance to operational modifications or deal with the confusion that conflicting leadership messages had created among our staff. Elena and I were able to move quickly to implement cost reductions, streamline processes, and develop new revenue streams without the internal political complications that had hampered previous change efforts. The turnaround strategy we implemented focused heavily on adapting to pandemic-related changes in customer behavior while building stronger foundations for long-term growth. We invested in online ordering systems, developed meal kit and take-home baking options, and created subscription services that provided recurring revenue streams less dependent on foot traffic. We also restructured our physical operations to reduce costs while improving efficiency, consolidating Jake's scattered expansion locations back into our original flagship store and renegotiating lease terms and supplier contracts to better align our expenses with realistic revenue projections. These changes were painful, but necessary to create a sustainable business model that could weather future economic uncertainties. Perhaps most importantly, we rebuilt relationships with customers and community partners that had been neglected during the period of internal conflict and rapid expansion. I personally reached out to longtime customers who had stopped coming to Sweet Dreams, apologizing for service issues and inviting them back to experience our renewed commitment to quality and customer service. The results of these efforts became apparent within the first 6 months of the acquisition, as Sweet Dreams began generating positive cash flow and rebuilding the customer base that had been eroded during Jake's tenure. While we were still far from fully recovering our pre-crisis revenue levels, the trajectory was clearly positive, and the business foundation was much more stable than it had been in years. Elena's involvement proved to be even more valuable than I had anticipated, as her experience and network provided access to opportunities and resources that I couldn't have developed on my own. She introduced me to other successful food business operators who became informal advisors, helped negotiate favorable terms with suppliers and vendors, and provided strategic guidance that prevented costly mistakes during the critical early months of my leadership. By the spring of 2021, Sweet Dreams had not only survived the pandemic, but was actually stronger and more resilient than it had been before the crisis. Our focus on operational efficiency and customer relationships had created a business model that could adapt to changing conditions while maintaining the quality and community connection that had originally made us successful. The personal transformation I experienced during this period was as significant as the business turnaround, as I developed confidence and leadership skills that I hadn't known I possessed. Taking responsibility for every aspect of the business, from strategic planning to daily operations, forced me to grow beyond my comfort zone and discover capabilities that had been suppressed during years of working in Jake's shadow. Jake, meanwhile, had struggled to find new opportunities that matched his self-perception as a visionary business leader. His attempts to secure management positions with other restaurant companies were hampered by the spectacular failure of his expansion strategy at Sweet Dreams, which had become known within the local business community as a cautionary tale about overextension and poor timing. The irony of his situation became apparent when he reached out to me in the summer of 2021, asking if there might be opportunities for him to return to Sweet Dreams in some capacity. His initial approach was tentative and indirect, communicated through our parents rather than directly, apparently testing whether I might be willing to consider bringing him back into the business he had nearly destroyed. I was surprised by my own emotional reaction to this overture, discovering that while I had moved beyond the anger and hurt of his previous betrayal, I also felt no obligation to rescue him from the consequences of his decisions. The business was thriving under my leadership. Our staff was more motivated and productive than they had been in years. And there was no operational need for Jake's involvement that would justify the risks of reintroducing the conflicts and power struggles that had previously plagued our operations. However, I also recognized that Sweet Dreams was still fundamentally a family business, and that completely shutting Jake out forever might create ongoing family tensions that could complicate other relationships. After extensive discussions with Elena and careful consideration of the potential impacts, I decided that I would be willing to consider Jake for an appropriate role if he demonstrated genuine understanding of what had gone wrong previously and commitment to supporting, rather than undermining, the current direction of the business. The conversation I had with Jake about potential future involvement was awkward and difficult, as it required both of us to acknowledge painful truths about our previous relationship and his leadership failures. To his credit, Jake did seem to have gained some perspective during his months away from Sweet Dreams, recognizing that his expansion strategy had been flawed and that his treatment of me had been unfair, counterproductive. However, it was also clear that Jake still struggled with accepting a subordinate role in the business where he had previously been the presumptive heir apparent. His suggestions for how he might contribute invariably involved significant authority and decision-making responsibility, indicating that he hadn't fully internalized the lessons of his previous failure or accepted the reality that leadership had permanently shifted to me. After several months of sporadic discussions and trial interactions, it became apparent that Jake wasn't ready to accept the kind of supportive role that would be appropriate given our history and the current needs of the business. His continued expectations of special treatment and his resistance to normal performance accountability made it clear that bringing him back would likely recreate the conflicts that had previously damaged Sweet Dreams. The final resolution came when Jake applied for a management position at a competing bakery across town, apparently concluding that he would be better served by starting fresh somewhere else rather than trying to rebuild his relationship with Sweet Dreams under my leadership. While part of me was relieved that this resolved the awkward family dynamics, I also felt some sadness that our relationship had been so damaged by business conflicts that collaboration was no longer possible. The success of Sweet Dreams under my leadership continued to build throughout 2021 and into 2022, as the strategies Elena and I had implemented proved their effectiveness and the business grew beyond even our optimistic projections. We expanded our online presence, developed new product lines that addressed changing consumer preferences, and built partnerships with other local businesses that created mutually beneficial marketing and cross-promotion opportunities. More importantly, Sweet Dreams had regained its position as a beloved community institution, with customers regularly commenting on the improved service, product quality, and overall experience they encountered when visiting our store. The staff seemed more engaged and motivated than they had been in years, benefiting from clearer leadership direction and more collaborative decision-making processes that valued their input and expertise. The financial results of our turnaround efforts exceeded even Elena's expectations, with Sweet Dreams generating profits that not only serviced our den obligations, but also provided returns for investors and funds for continued business development. We were able to repay Elena's initial investment ahead of schedule, while maintaining her ongoing partnership in future growth opportunities. Perhaps most satisfying was the recognition I received from industry organizations and business groups for the successful turnaround of Sweet Dreams during one of the most challenging periods in restaurant history. Being invited to speak at conferences and consulted by other struggling food businesses validated the approach Elena and I had developed and demonstrated that the lessons learned from our experience had broader applicability. The transformation of my relationship with my parents was another unexpected benefit of the business turnaround, as they began to see me as a capable leader rather than just their younger daughter who worked in the bakery. Their pride in what I had accomplished was evident in how they talked about Sweet Dreams with friends and neighbors, and their confidence in my judgment extended to other areas of life where they had previously been more directive and controlling. The contrast between my current situation and Jake's continued struggles was stark and sometimes uncomfortable, particularly during family gatherings where the success of Sweet Dreams was inevitably discussed. While I tried to be gracious and avoid emphasizing the differences in our circumstances, it was impossible to ignore the fact that the business he had nearly destroyed was now thriving under my leadership. Jake's employment at the competing bakery had not gone well, with reports filtering back through industry connections that his management style and expansion ideas were creating similar conflicts to those that had plagued Sweet Dreams during his tenure. The pattern of overconfidence, poor execution, and blame shifting that had characterized his previous leadership seemed to be repeating itself in his new environment. When Jake was eventually let go from his position at the competing bakery in early 2022, he found himself in the difficult position of needing employment in an industry where his reputation had been damaged by 2 consecutive failures. His attempts to secure management positions with other food service companies were unsuccessful, as potential employers were understandably cautious about hiring someone with a track record of operational problems, interpersonal conflicts. The desperation in Jake's situation became apparent when he began reaching out to former Sweet Dreams employees, apparently hoping to gather information that might help him understand why the business was succeeding under my leadership when it had struggled under his management. These conversations were awkward for our staff, who were loyal to me but also sympathetic to Jake's personal difficulties. The culmination of this difficult period came when Jake swallowed his pride and formally applied for a position at Sweet Dreams, submitting a resume and cover letter through our normal hiring process rather than attempting to leverage family relationships for special consideration. The application was for an assistant management position that would have represented a significant step down from his previous role as general manager, but apparently he had concluded that working for me was preferable to continued unemployment. Reading Jake's job application was surreal, as it required me to evaluate my brother's qualifications and suitability for employment in the business, where we had both grown up, and where our family conflicts had played out so dramatically. His resume was professionally written and highlighted his education and experience, but it couldn't disguise the fact that his most recent positions had ended poorly and that he was essentially starting over in his career. The cover letter Jake submitted was carefully crafted to acknowledge his previous mistakes while expressing genuine interest in contributing to Sweet Dreams' continued success under my leadership. He wrote about having gained perspective during his time away from the business and described specific ways he believed he could add value without disrupting the positive culture and operational improvements that had been implemented. Despite the professional tone of his application, I could read between the lines to understand how difficult it must have been for Jake to apply for a subordinate position in the business where he had once been the presumptive leader. The humiliation of having to ask his younger sister for employment after publicly blaming her for the business's problems represented a complete reversal of our previous family dynamics. The decision about whether to interview Jake, let alone hire him, required careful consideration of multiple factors beyond just his qualifications and the business needs of Sweet Dreams. Elena and I discussed the potential impacts on staff morale, customer relationships, and operational stability that might result from bringing Jake back into the organization, even in a reduced capacity. We also had to consider the family dynamics that would inevitably be affected by my decision, as hiring Jake might be seen as magnanimous and healing, while rejecting his application could be viewed as vindictive and destructive to family relationships. The weight of being in a position to determine my brother's employment future was heavier than I had anticipated when I first set out to prove that I could successfully lead Sweet Dreams. After extensive deliberation and consultation with trusted advisors, I decided that I would interview Jake for the position, treating him fairly as any other candidate while maintaining professional standards and, quote, expectations. This approach would allow me to evaluate whether he had genuinely learned from his previous mistakes and was prepared to contribute constructively to Sweet Dreams' continued success. The interview itself was one of the most awkward and emotionally charged conversations of my life, as Jake and I attempted to navigate the complex intersection of family history, business requirements, and professional boundaries. He was clearly nervous and trying hard to present himself as a changed person who understood the mistakes he had made and was committed to doing better. When I asked Jake directly about his previous criticisms of my leadership and his public statements blaming me for Sweet Dreams' problems, he acknowledged that his behavior had been unfair and counterproductive. He expressed genuine remorse for the damage his actions had caused to both the business and our family relationships, though I sensed that his apology was motivated as much by his current desperate circumstances, by authentic reflection and growth. The most telling moment of the interview came when I asked Jake how he would handle disagreements with my management decisions, given his history of resistance to approaches that differed from his own vision. His answer was carefully prepared, but revealed that he still struggled with accepting my authority, suggesting that old patterns of conflict might reassert themselves if he were placed in a position where he felt his ideas weren't being adequately considered. Based on the interview and my assessment of the risks and benefits involved, I made the difficult decision not to offer Jake the position at Sweet Dreams. While I believed he was sincere in his desire to contribute positively, I also concluded that the potential for renewed conflict and the disruption it might cause to our successful operations outweighed the benefits of giving him another chance. The conversation in which I informed Jake of my decision was painful for both of us, as it represented the final acknowledgement that our professional relationship might never recover from the damage that had been done during his tenure as general manager. He accepted the news with more grace than I had expected, perhaps recognizing that his previous actions had made any other outcome unlikely. In the months that followed, Jake eventually found employment with a food distribution company in a role that utilized his industry knowledge while keeping him away from operational management responsibilities that had proven problematic in his previous positions. The job represented a fresh start in a different sector of the food industry, where his past difficulties at Sweet Dreams were less relevant, and he could rebuild his professional reputation. The resolution of Jake's employment situation allowed our family relationships to begin healing from the conflicts that had dominated our interactions for nearly 2 years. While things would never return to the easy collaboration of our earlier years, we were able to establish new boundaries and expectations that allowed us to coexist peacefully during family gatherings and business discussions. Sweet Dreams continued to thrive and grow under my leadership, becoming not just a successful business, but a symbol of resilience and transformation that inspired other family businesses facing similar challenges. Elena and I had created something that went beyond profit margins and operational efficiency. We had built a workplace culture that valued creativity, collaboration, and continuous improvement while maintaining the personal touch and community connection that had originally made Sweet Dreams special. The success of our turnaround strategy attracted attention from business schools and industry publications, leading to case study development and speaking opportunities that further established my reputation as a leader who could navigate complex family business dynamics while implementing effective operational changes. These external validations were personally satisfying, but more importantly, they brought visibility to Sweet Dreams that translated into new customers and business opportunities. By 2023, we were able to expand our operations in a measured, strategic way that reflected the lessons learned from Jake's previous overextension. Rather than opening multiple locations simultaneously, we focused on developing complementary revenue streams that leveraged our existing strengths while diversifying our income sources. This included a successful catering division, a line of frozen products sold through local grocery stores, and baking classes that brought customers into our kitchen to learn techniques while building deeper relationships with our brand. The irony of implementing successful expansion after criticizing Jake's growth strategy wasn't lost on me, but the difference lay in the timing, financing, and execution of our approach. Where Jake had pursued aggressive growth during a period of declining core business performance, we expanded from a position of strength with carefully managed risk and sustainable financing that didn't threaten our fundamental operations. Elena's role evolved from crisis investor to strategic partner and mentor, as her initial emergency intervention became a long-term collaboration that benefited both Sweet Dreams and her broader investment portfolio. Her success with our partnership led to opportunities to work with other struggling food businesses, creating a consulting practice that drew on the lessons learned from our turnaround experience. The most unexpected development was the recognition I received from my parents for having saved not just Sweet Dreams, but their financial security and retirement plans. The business they had built over decades was not only preserved, but significantly more valuable than it had been before the crisis, providing them with options and security they hadn't dared hope for during the darkest days of Jake's leadership. My relationship with my parents shifted from the traditional child-parent dynamic to something more like a partnership between equals, as they came to rely on my judgment and expertise in ways that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. Their pride in my accomplishments was evident in how they spoke about Sweet Dreams and my role in its transformation, representing a validation that was more meaningful than any external recognition. The transformation of Sweet Dreams also had broader implications for our community, as our success demonstrated that local Family-owned businesses could compete effectively against chain competitors when they focused on quality, service, and authentic connection with their customers. Other small business owners began reaching out for advice and collaboration, creating a network of mutual support that strengthened the entire local business ecosystem. The personal growth I experienced during this journey was perhaps the most valuable outcome of the entire experience, as I discovered leadership capabilities and business acumen that I hadn't known I possessed. The confidence gained from successfully navigating the crisis and rebuilding Sweet Dreams stronger than before gave me faith in my ability to handle whatever challenges the future might bring. Looking back on the year that changed everything, I realized that Jake's betrayal and my family's initial rejection of my leadership had actually created the opportunity for me to prove my capabilities in ways that might never have been possible under normal circumstances. The adversity forced me to develop skills, build relationships, and take risks that ultimately made me a better leader and a stronger person. The moment when I sat in my office chair, waiting for Jake to arrive for his job interview, represented the completion of a circle that had begun with his finger pointing at me across the bakery counter, blaming me for problems I hadn't created. The reversal of our positions was complete, but more importantly, I had demonstrated that his assessment of my capabilities had been fundamentally wrong. When Jake walked into that office and saw me sitting behind the desk he had once occupied, the shock and humiliation on his face were everything I had imagined during the long months of building toward that moment. But rather than feeling the satisfaction of revenge I had expected, I mostly felt sadness for the relationship we had lost and the opportunities we had both missed because of his inability to see me as an equal partner rather than a subordinate to be managed. The conversation that followed was professional but charged with unspoken history, as we both navigated the strange new reality where our family hierarchy had been completely inverted. Jake's attempts to maintain dignity while essentially begging for employment from the sister he had dismissed created an awkwardness that no amount of professional courtesy could entirely mask. In the end, my decision not to hire Jake wasn't motivated by revenge or spite, but by a realistic assessment of what would be best for Sweet Dreams and everyone who depended on its continued success. The business had become bigger than our family conflicts, employing people who deserved stability and serving customers who trusted us to maintain the quality and service they had come to expect. The year that followed Jake's unsuccessful job interview saw Sweet Dreams reach new heights of success and community recognition, validating the approach Elena and I had developed and proving that the lessons learned from our crisis could be applied to drive sustained growth and profitability. We were invited to participate in regional business development initiatives, served as mentors for other family businesses facing transitions, and became a model for how traditional enterprises could adapt, thrive in changing economic conditions. The personal satisfaction of this success was enhanced by the knowledge that it had been achieved through focus, hard work, and strategic thinking rather than luck or family connections. Every milestone we reached represented proof that Jake's dismissive assessment of my capabilities had been wrong, and that his approach to business leadership had been fundamentally flawed. As Sweet Dreams entered its fourth year under my leadership, the business bore little resemblance to the struggling operation Jake had left behind. Except for the commitment to quality and community service that had always been at the heart of our family's vision. We had preserved everything that made Sweet Dreams special, while adding the operational excellence and strategic focus that positioned us for continued growth and success. The story of how I bought the family business that had rejected me became something of a local legend, inspiring other entrepreneurs who faced family conflicts or business challenges that seemed insurmountable. Speaking requests and media interviews provided platforms to share the lessons learned from our experience, hopefully helping others avoid some of the pitfalls we had encountered. Elena often reminded me that the most important outcome of our partnership wasn't the financial returns or business accolades, but the demonstration that family businesses could survive and thrive through transitions that might otherwise destroy them. The key was maintaining focus on what truly mattered, while having the courage to make difficult decisions that served the long-term interests of all stakeholders. The relationship between Jake and me remained cordial but distant, as we had both accepted that our professional paths would continue to diverge despite our shared history and family connections. He had found stability in his distribution company role, while I had built something significant with sweet dreams that fulfilled both my professional ambitions and my desire to honor our family's legacy. My parents, now in their 70s, were able to enjoy their retirement with the security that comes from knowing their life's work would continue under leadership they trusted and respected. Their transition from active management to advisory roles had been smoother than anyone had anticipated, largely because they had confidence in my decision-making and Elena's strategic guidance. The final measure of Sweet Dreams' transformation came when we were approached by a national bakery chain interested in franchising our concept and recipes for broader distribution. The offer represented validation that what we had built was not just locally successful, but had broader market appeal that could be scaled and replicated. After careful consideration and extensive discussions with Elena and my parents, I decided to decline the franchising opportunity, concluding that the personal touch and community connection that made Sweet Dreams special couldn't be replicated on a large scale without losing the authenticity that was central to our brand identity. This decision reinforced my belief that success shouldn't be measured only by revenue growth or expansion opportunities, but by the ability to create something meaningful and sustainable that serves multiple stakeholders while staying true to core values and principles. Sweet Dreams had become exactly what I had envisioned when I first developed my turnaround plan, a thriving business that honored our family's legacy while building toward an even brighter future. The journey from blamed scapegoat to successful CEO had been longer and more difficult than I had imagined when Jake first pointed his finger at me in that family meeting. But it had also been more rewarding and transformative than I could have anticipated. The experience had taught me that sometimes the greatest opportunities come disguised as devastating setbacks, and that the strength to overcome adversity often lies dormant until circumstances force its development. As I sat in my office on the 5th anniversary of taking over Sweet Dreams, looking out at the bustling bakery floor where employees were preparing for another busy day of serving customers who had become like extended family, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this point. Jake's betrayal had hurt deeply at the time, but it had also created the opportunity for me to discover capabilities and build relationships that had ultimately led to something better than I could have achieved within the constraints of our previous family dynamic. The young woman who had been dismissed and blamed for failures that weren't her fault had evolved into a confident leader who had proven that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well and succeeding on your own terms. Sweet Dreams wasn't just a successful business anymore, it was a testament to the power of perseverance, strategic thinking, and the willingness to bet everything on your own abilities when everyone else has given up on you. The story that began with family conflict and business failure had become one of redemption, growth, and the kind of success that can only be achieved when you refuse to accept other people's limitations as your own. Jake had been wrong about me, wrong about the business, and wrong about what it would take to build something lasting and meaningful. The empty chair where he used to sit served as a daily reminder that leadership isn't inherited or assumed, but earned through the ability to make difficult decisions and deliver results when everything is on the line. Sweet Dreams had indeed become the family legacy my parents had always hoped for. But under leadership, they had never expected, and through a path none of us could have anticipated when we first started working together in that small storefront so many years ago. The bakery that had nearly been lost to poor judgment and family conflict had become stronger, more successful, and more meaningful than it had ever been before, proving that sometimes the best way to honor the past is to have the courage to reimagine the future. The ripple effects of Sweet Dreams' transformation extended far beyond our immediate family and business operations, creating impacts that I couldn't have foreseen when I first began developing my turnaround strategy. Other family businesses in our community began reaching out for advice and mentorship, having heard about our successful navigation of crisis and transition. These conversations revealed that our experience, while unique in its specific details, reflected broader patterns of family business challenges that many entrepreneurs faced but rarely discussed openly. Elena and I decided to formalize this consulting work, establishing a small advisory practice that specialized in helping family businesses navigate conflicts, succession planning, and operational transitions. Our first official client was a third-generation hardware store facing competition from big-box retailers and internal disagreements about modernization strategies. The parallels to our own experience were striking, including a younger family member with innovative ideas being dismissed by older relatives who preferred traditional approaches. Working with this family reminded me of the isolation and frustration I had felt during my own period of being marginalized and blamed for problems beyond my control. The daughter in this family, Maria Santos, was brilliant and passionate about preserving her grandfather's legacy while adapting to changing market conditions, but she was consistently overruled by her father and uncles, who viewed her suggestions as threats to established ways of doing business. The consulting engagement required me to draw on skills I had developed during my own struggle to regain control of Sweet Dreams, including diplomatic communication, strategic analysis, and the ability to present complex ideas in ways that didn't trigger defensive reactions from entrenched leadership. Elena's experience with multiple family business transitions proved invaluable in helping navigate the emotional dynamics that often complicated rational business discussions. Over the course of 6 months, we helped the Santos family develop a succession plan that preserved their core values while implementing necessary changes to compete effectively in their evolving market. Maria was gradually given more responsibility and authority, while her father and uncles were able to maintain dignified roles that honored their contributions while making room for fresh perspectives. Approaches. The success of this engagement led to referrals and additional consulting opportunities, creating a side business that provided both financial benefits and personal satisfaction from helping other families avoid some of the painful conflicts that had nearly destroyed Sweet Dreams. Each client situation was unique, but common themes emerged around communication failures, resistance to change, and the difficulty of separating family relationships from business decisions. One particularly challenging case involved a family restaurant where the founder's 3 children were locked in a bitter dispute over expansion plans, with each sibling advocating for dramatically different approaches that reflected their individual personalities and risk tolerances. The eldest son wanted to maintain the status quo, the middle daughter pushed for aggressive growth, and the youngest son advocated for pivoting to a completely different concept that would appeal to younger demographics. The parallels to my own family dynamics were uncomfortable but illuminating, as I could see elements of my relationship with Jake reflected in the Santos siblings' interactions. The consulting work forced me to examine my own biases and assumptions, helping me understand that family business conflicts often arose from legitimate differences in vision and values, rather than simple personality clashes, or power struggles. This broader perspective on family business dynamics helped me process my own experiences with more objectivity and less emotional residue. While Jake's treatment of me had been unfair and damaging, I began to understand that his behavior might have been driven by genuine fear about the business's future and his own security, rather than pure malice or dull desire to hurt me personally. The consulting practice also provided opportunities to stay connected with industry trends and best practices that benefited Sweet Dreams directly. Each client engagement exposed me to different approaches to common challenges, from inventory management and staff training to marketing strategies and financial planning. These insights often triggered ideas for improvements or innovations that I could implement in our own operations. One of the most valuable lessons from our consulting work was the importance of documenting processes and decisions in ways that preserved institutional knowledge while facilitating smooth transitions between generations or leadership teams. Many of the families we worked with had lost critical information when founders retired or passed away, creating operational disruptions that could have been avoided with better planning and documentation. This lesson prompted me to implement comprehensive knowledge management systems at Sweet Dreams, ensuring that recipes, supplier relationships, customer preferences, and operational procedures were recorded in ways that would survive personnel changes and provide continuity for future leadership. The process of documenting everything we did also revealed inefficiencies and inconsistencies that we were able to address, improving our overall performance while building institutional resilience. The success of both Sweet Dreams and our consulting practice attracted attention from business schools and industry organizations interested in studying family business dynamics and transition strategies. I was invited to guest lecture at several universities, sharing our story with MBA students who were often surprised by the complexity and emotional intensity of family business conflicts. These speaking engagements provided platforms to discuss broader themes about entrepreneurship, leadership development, and the intersection of family relationships with business operations. The questions from students and faculty often challenged me to articulate lessons learned and best practices in ways that could be applied beyond our specific situation and industry. One recurring theme in these academic discussions was the role of gender in family business succession. As many families still defaulted to traditional assumptions about male leadership, despite evidence that women often brought valuable perspectives and capabilities to business management. My experience of being initially dismissed and later proving my abilities resonated with many female students who anticipated facing similar challenges in their own careers. The visibility from speaking engagements and consulting work led to media interviews and feature articles that positioned me as an expert on family business transitions and crisis management. While I was initially uncomfortable with this public attention, Elena convinced me that sharing our story could help other entrepreneurs facing similar challenges, making the exposure worthwhile despite my natural preference for privacy. The media coverage brought unexpected benefits to Sweet Dreams, as customers who learned about our story through articles and interviews often mentioned feeling more connected to our business and more committed to supporting our success. The narrative of overcoming adversity and family conflict to build something meaningful resonated with many people who had faced their own challenges with family relationships or career setbacks. This increased customer loyalty translated into measurable business improvements, including higher average transaction values, more frequent visits, and increased word-of-mouth referrals that helped us continue growing our customer base. The emotional connection customers felt to our story seemed to enhance their appreciation for our products and services, creating a virtuous cycle of engagement and support. The financial success of Sweet Dreams under my leadership also created opportunities to give back to our community in ways that hadn't been possible during the crisis years. We established a scholarship fund for local students interested in culinary careers, sponsored community events that brought people together around food and celebration, and partnered with local nonprofits to provide catering services for fundraising events at cost. These community engagement activities reflected my belief that successful businesses had obligations beyond generating profits for owners and investors. Sweet Dreams had been supported by loyal customers during difficult times, and I felt a responsibility to contribute to the broader community that had sustained us through the transition period. The scholarship program proved particularly meaningful, as it connected us with young people who shared the passion for baking and food service that had driven my own career development. Several scholarship recipients became part-time employees at Sweet Dreams, bringing fresh energy and perspectives while learning practical skills that complemented their formal education. One of these young employees, a culinary school student named David Kim, reminded me of myself at that age, with intense curiosity about technique and innovation, combined with deep respect for traditional POM methods and family recipes. Working with David and other young team members helped me understand that mentoring and development were becoming important aspects of my role as a business leader. The mentoring relationships I developed with younger employees and scholarship recipients provided personal satisfaction that went beyond the business benefits of having engaged, motivated staff members. Sharing knowledge and experience while learning from fresh perspectives created a dynamic environment that kept Sweet Dreams innovative and responsive to changing customer preferences. As Sweet Dreams approached its 30th anniversary under my family's ownership, I began planning a celebration that would honor our history while looking forward to future possibilities. The anniversary represented not just the passage of time but the completion of a transformation that had nearly been derailed by family conflict and poor business decisions. The celebration planning process became an opportunity to reflect on everything we had accomplished and overcome during the turbulent years of transition and rebuilding. The business that had once been on the verge of bankruptcy and family dissolution had become a thriving enterprise that provided meaningful employment, supported community initiatives, and served as a model for other family businesses facing similar challenges. Elena's continued partnership and friendship had been crucial to this success, providing not just financial resources and business expertise, but also emotional support and strategic guidance during difficult decisions and challenging periods. Our collaboration had evolved from crisis intervention to long-term partnership, demonstrating that business relationships could become personally meaningful while remaining professionally effective. The anniversary celebration also provided an opportunity to recognize the employees who had stayed with Sweet Dreams through the difficult transition period, showing loyalty and commitment despite uncertainty about the business's future. Many of these team members had grown professionally during the rebuilding process, taking on additional responsibilities and contributing ideas that improved our operations and customer service. The planning process included reaching out to customers who had been part of Sweet Dreams' story over the years, inviting them to share memories and experiences that had made our business meaningful in their lives. The responses were overwhelming, with hundreds of people sharing stories about birthday cakes, wedding desserts, daily coffee visits, and family traditions that had been enhanced by their connection to our bakery. Reading these customer stories reinforced my understanding of why preserving Sweet Dreams had been so important, not just for my family's financial security, but for the community relationships and traditions that had grown up around our business over nearly 3 decades. The bakery had become part of many families' histories, creating emotional connections that went far beyond commercial transactions. The anniversary celebration itself was a community event that brought together customers, suppliers, employees, and local business partners who had supported Sweet Dreams through various challenges and transitions. The evening included displays of historical photographs, testimonials from longtime customers, and demonstrations of baking techniques that connected our past with our present. Jake attended the anniversary celebration, having been invited by our parents despite the complicated history between us. His presence created some awkward moments, but also provided an opportunity for both of us to demonstrate that we had moved beyond the bitter conflicts that had once threatened to destroy our family relationships. The conversation we had that evening was more relaxed and genuine than any we had shared since the crisis began, with both of us acknowledging that we had grown and changed during the years since our business partnership had ended. Jake seemed genuinely proud of what I had accomplished with Sweet Dreams, and I was able to appreciate his current success in his distribution company role without feeling threatened or defensive. This interaction suggested that time and separate successes had allowed us to develop the emotional distance necessary to see each other more objectively, recognizing strengths and contributions while accepting that our approaches to business and leadership were fundamentally incompatible. The healing wasn't complete, but it represented progress toward a healthier family dynamic that could support ongoing relationships without recreating old conflicts. The anniversary celebration concluded with my remarks about the journey Sweet Dreams had taken from crisis to success, acknowledging the contributions of everyone who had made our survival and growth possible. I spoke about the lessons learned from adversity, the importance of community support, and the responsibility that successful businesses had to contribute to the broader good. The response to my speech was overwhelmingly positive, with many attendees commenting afterward about feeling inspired by our story of resilience and transformation. Several other business owners mentioned that they had gained new perspectives on their own challenges and opportunities, suggesting that sharing our experience had achieved Elena's goal of helping others learn from what we had accomplished. In the months following the anniversary celebration, Sweet Dreams continued to build on the momentum generated by increased community engagement and positive media attention. We launched new product lines that reflected changing consumer preferences while maintaining our commitment to quality and traditional techniques, expanded our catering services to serve a broader geographic area, and developed online ordering systems that made our products accessible to customers beyond our immediate community. The success of these initiatives validated the strategic approach Elena and I had developed, which emphasized sustainable growth based on operational excellence and strong customer relationships rather than aggressive expansion that might compromise quality or financial stability. Each new opportunity was evaluated carefully to ensure it aligned with our core values and contributed to long-term success rather than short-term revenue gains. As I looked toward the future of Sweet Dreams, I felt confident that the foundation we had built was strong enough to support continued growth and adaptation to changing market conditions. The business systems, team capabilities, and community relationships we had developed provided resilience and flexibility that would serve us well regardless of what challenges or opportunities emerged. The personal transformation I had experienced during this journey continued to provide benefits beyond the business context. As the confidence and leadership skills developed through crisis management and strategic planning proved valuable in other aspects of my life. The experience of being dismissed, and then proving my capabilities, had created a deep sense of self-reliance and determination that influenced how I approached all types of challenges and opportunities. The story of Sweet Dreams' transformation from near failure to thriving success had become more than just a business case study. It had evolved into a testament to the power of perseverance, strategic thinking, and the willingness to bet everything on your own abilities when conventional wisdom suggests giving up. The young woman who had been blamed for problems she didn't create had become a leader who created solutions that others couldn't imagine, proving that sometimes the best response to rejection is simply to become undeniably successful on your own terms.